the administration adopted what you had essentially laid out for a period of time as the campaign plan for Afghanistan. And that was unprecedented, right? To have someone from the Central Intelligence Agency sort of outlining the war plan.
It breaks all the rules. The job of CIA is to inform policy, it's not to make policy.
Robert Grenier is the former CIA station chief for Pakistan and Afghanistan. He was responsible for designing the Afghanistan war plan following the 9/11 attacks that drove the Taliban and al-Qaeda from Kandahar. This was a stunning turn of events that the veteran intelligence officer has captured in vivid detail in his new book, 88 Days to Kandahar, a CIA diary. Vice News sat down with Grenier at his home in Virginia to talk about America's longest war. Post 9/11, you were the chief of station in Pakistan at the time. What happened next?
Well, as the chief of station in Pakistan at that time, I had responsibility not only for Pakistan, but also for all of Taliban-occupied Afghanistan, which was 90% of the country. In a sense, the story began well before. About 18 months before 9/11, I and the others in my station were working very hard to try to organize a anti-Taliban tribal rebellion in the South. Now, we weren't actively doing that because we didn't have a presidential finding that would permit us to do that. We didn't have the authorities. But we were reaching out and establishing relationships that we hoped would enable us to lead that sort of a rebellion if and when the order came to go forward. And obviously that order came to go forward in the immediate days after 9/11.
In the immediate days after 9/11, you had hoped, according to your book, that you could utilize all of those assets that you'd been developing relationships with to actually accomplish either overthrowing the Taliban or pushing al-Qaeda, denying them safe haven in Afghanistan. That was the initial goal, right?
As I tried to explain to Washington at the outset, look, at the end of the day, unless we're going to colonize Afghanistan, we need to have some sort of a political dispensation in that country that will deny it as a safe haven to international terrorists. And so initially, we were hoping that the Taliban would be that force. Now, they had refused up until then. With the potential imminence of an American invasion, we were hoping that that would cause Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, to change his mind. He did not change his mind, and so I worked very hard in 2 long meetings with his deputy to try to convince him to push Mullah Omar aside and do what his chief could not. And he very briefly agreed, but that agreement didn't survive his return to Kandahar, and he quickly thought better of it. And so in the end, we had to push the Taliban writ large aside and come in on the side of the Northern Alliance in the Civil War, but very, very importantly, at the same time, support tribal leaders in the Pashtun south of Afghanistan who were willing to rise up against the Taliban. The Taliban was an indigenous religious movement, really, much more so than a political party. They were a movement in southern Afghanistan, in the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan. And it was that movement which was empowered by the situation after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, when the different Mujahideen leaders who had united in the fight against the Soviets fell to fighting against one another. And so Afghanistan was a complete mess. There was absolute insecurity. People, particularly in the South, were looking for someone to save them. And the Taliban was that force, and Islam was their driving motivation. And when you don't have anything to include security, the one thing that you most crave is security, and that's what the Taliban was able to provide.
In the post 9/11 days, the administration adopted what you had essentially laid out for a period of time as the campaign plan for Afghanistan. And that was unprecedented, right? To have someone from the Central Intelligence Agency sort of outlining the war plan.
It breaks all the rules. The job of CIA is to inform policy, it's not to make policy. And because CIA was in such a unique position in Afghanistan, first of all, the country was very little known, very little understood, including even within the intelligence community. Certainly in the executive branch, writ large, we quickly determined that the best way forward was for us to leverage relationships with Afghans on the ground who could do what we could not over the long term, and that is to deny their country as a safe haven to international terrorists. And because CIA had those relationships, people were looking to CIA to actually lead this effort. And so that put me in a very, very unique position. And I laid out first for the War Cabinet and then for the President how I thought we should go forward, at least in terms of broad outline. And that's what the President approved.
And so that began what you describe in your book as the first Afghan war.
Right.
Can you explain these distinctions? How many Afghan wars are there?
Well, we don't know yet. And you could go back to the days of the anti-Soviet jihad when the U.S. at least played a supporting role for the Mujahideen. But in terms of direct U.S. involvement in hostilities in Afghanistan, obviously that began with the immediate post 9/11 period. And as I describe in the book, the 88 days, it was 88 days from 9/11 until the 7th of December 2001 when we and our Afghan allies succeeded in driving both al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of their capital, which was Kandahar. And so that, to my mind, was the first American-Afghan war, the one that we thought, at least, that we'd won. And that, in fact, we had the opportunity to consolidate that victory. I think that we and the Afghans, they don't escape blame in all of this, failed to do that. And by the time I returned to focus once again personally on Afghanistan and Pakistan in the spring of 2005, by that time I was the director of counterterrorism, made an extensive visit both to Pakistan and to Afghanistan. And you could see at that point that the Taliban was beginning to gain traction once again in southern and eastern Afghanistan. We didn't know how serious it was at the time, but that, to my mind, was the start of the second American-Afghan war, the one where the U.S. essentially took over. After 2005, as we began to see the situation slipping away, and in a sense, in so many words, we as a government decided that Afghanistan was too important to be left to Afghans. And we tried to turn Afghanistan, I would argue, into something that it was not. A highly centralized state with a large army, large national police force, and we tried to do things that we certainly were not going to be able to do in the amount of time that we made available, and that arguably Afghans were never going to be able to sustain on their own. And I think that was the big error that we made. That's led us up to the present and the substantial U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I'm concerned that at some point, when things shift again and the front lines in the global jihad move once again, that once again international terrorists in significant numbers may be motivated to come back to Afghanistan, and we may be forced to fight another American-Afghan war.
What do you think the prognosis is for Afghanistan now in this diminished American presence there?
I don't think we will ever see a coalition government involving the Taliban in Kabul. There's always going to be a place for the Taliban as long as we're around in Pashtun society, and somehow that's going to have to be accommodated. And I think that is the story of the next few years. I'm afraid that if the international community, particularly the United States, abandon Afghanistan, financially especially, that this government could go under and we could end up in a situation very similar to the one that we faced just before 9/11.
Now we're facing a new terrorist threat, an emergent terrorist threat in northern Iraq and Syria,
Yes.
in the Islamic State. What are the lessons that we can draw to apply to this new threat that has emerged in the Islamic State?
Well, you're suggesting that the situation with the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call it, in Iraq and Syria is quite different from what we faced in Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan, but there are some very important analogies to be made. And I think it really, from our perspective, it has to do with what the constructive U.S. role should be. What we're facing in Iraq, and even more so in Syria, is that we don't have effective allies on the ground in those countries. We need indigenous forces. We don't have them. Already we're beginning to see pressure build to see a much more robust American effort in those countries. And I think that would be a very, very serious mistake because, as I say, there, as in Afghanistan, at the end of the day, these countries are going to be ruled, governed by the indigenous people. And if we come in a very heavy-handed way, we qualitatively change the nature of the struggle. It becomes the infidels fighting against good Muslims. And that actually undercuts our natural allies in the area. It strengthens our natural enemies. That's not where we want to be, and that's where we could end up, just as we did in the latter years in Afghanistan.
What are our lessons learned from the Afghanistan conflicts?
The primary lesson that we need to learn has to do with this large, in fact, global problem that we have of an ungoverned space. Those are the spaces that are used by international terrorists as safe havens, and those are the spaces that need to be filled one way or another. And those are not spaces that can be permanently filled by the United States or the West writ large. That's something that can only be done by Muslims. And so I think if there's a lesson that is reinforced by our experience in Afghanistan, it's that this global struggle is really not between the West and a group of radical Islamists. This is a struggle within the Islamic world for the heart and the soul and the future of the Islamic world. And ultimately, it's Muslims who are going to determine the victor in all this.
In 2002, as the U.S. was secretly laying the groundwork for another invasion, this time in Iraq, Grenier returned to Washington and was named Iraq Mission Manager. He was responsible for all of the CIA's intelligence operations and analysis in the country. Were there mistakes made that helped to foster what we see now as the rise of the Islamic State?
The short answer is yes. There were many unintended consequences of decisions that we made in a different context, particularly with regard to Iraq. Given the extent to which I have been very critical of the George W. Bush administration and the way that they conducted that campaign in Iraq, some people may be surprised to learn that, in fact, I supported the effort at the outset. I supported the idea of invading Iraq in order to topple Saddam Hussein, and we could spend a long time talking about the reasons for that. I've not given up that idea. That said, as soon as we won the military campaign, as we knew we would, and relatively easily, I think we made a series of very bad mistakes. Now, we don't know how history would have turned out if we had followed what I would regard as wiser policies, but I certainly felt at the time, and I think history has borne out, that we made some very serious mistakes in formally disbanding the Iraqi army, in formally disbanding the Ba'ath Party. And what we did, just as in Afghanistan, essentially we and our Afghan allies conveyed the idea to the Taliban that there's no place for you in the new Afghanistan, we conveyed the conception to Sunnis writ large that there really is no place for you in the new Iraq. And I think it was exaggerated by them, but that was the clear idea that they got. That's what drove the insurgency that we fought. And it was that insurgency then that created the space for Islamic extremists to come in and essentially take over the struggle. I spent about 16 years overseas, mostly in Muslim countries, mostly in primitive Muslim countries. And during that time, you managed to pick up a lot of stuff. Old guns in Afghanistan and daggers from the Arabian Peninsula and Pakistan.
This is Yemen, right?
This Yemen,
Yeah.
Exactly. And this one is from Morocco. This is a gold inlaid crysknife from Indonesia. This is a particularly interesting one, I think. This is all gold fill, and if you take a look at the blade, it's all it's watered steel. And this is an old manuscript that was given to me as a gift by a very dear friend in North Africa. And of course, it's all handwritten, probably about 150 or more years old.
Grenier was working at CIA when the agency received approval in 2002 to use so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, or EITs, on suspected high-value terrorists who were detained at secret black site prisons. In his book, Grenier said that by the time he inherited the EIT program a few years later as director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, it was efficient and highly disciplined. And with the exception of waterboarding, he supported the continued use of the methods. In the news very prominently lately is a retrospective look at the CIA's rendition and detention program, and there's a lot of debate about the efficacy of that. Is there the potential for that to now come back into play as we're fighting a new threat in the Islamic State? And how do those two work together?
When we were capturing people, detention and interrogation was a very important issue. And the reason that we are not capturing as important people in anything like the numbers that we were before is because they're no longer present in the places where we and allied services can capture them. For the most part, they are in ungoverned space, whether it's in Iraq or Syria or Yemen or Somalia, the tribal areas in Pakistan. So it's not as though the U.S. government, made a strategic or a tactical decision. We're going to stop trying to capture these people. We're going to kill them instead. It's that we just don't have the same opportunities to capture them that we once did.
How critical was that program in 2002 and 2006?
Right. Yeah, I inherited the program as it had evolved when I took over counterterrorism in late 2004 and into 2005. 2002, 2003, it was critically important. Al-Qaeda was a very disciplined, centralized organization. We didn't have good intelligence sources on Al-Qaeda at the time. The only real insight that we got in the early days on Al-Qaeda was through capturing these individuals and interrogating them. Now, a majority, even of the worst, the most valuable, if you will, who came into CIA hands, a majority of those never saw anything more coercive than what you would expect to find in a U.S. police precinct. There was, however, a minority of those with whom we engaged in harsh interrogation. And of course, that has become a very politically sensitive issue since. But in terms of what came out of that program writ large, it was critical to us at the time. We didn't understand our enemy, and I think there's a lot that's probably not really understood. People sort of have this Jack Bauer conception that you interrogate somebody aggressively, and he tells you where the bomb is hidden, and you get there just before it goes off. In real life, it doesn't work like that. In real life counterterrorism, it's all about the people. And in a disciplined organization where they carefully compartment information, as Al-Qaeda did, even capturing a senior member of the organization is probably not going to tell you very much about ongoing plots. What they can tell you about is the people. And so if you get to the people before they can mature and launch those plots, you can keep those plots from reaching fruition. That's really what we were about. We were trying to find out about their colleagues. Some of them were willing to give up that information relatively easily. Some of them it was very, very difficult.
Do you have a personal opinion about the enhanced interrogation techniques?
Nobody in CIA was elected. CIA, just as the military, has to assure itself that the orders that it's given by the president are legal. But once they've assured themselves that it's legal, they have a professional responsibility to follow through. And part of the concern that I have with the political controversy that we're seeing today is that we run a serious risk of creating a generation in CIA which thinks that they should be deciding for themselves and for their own personal and bureaucratic reasons which of their lawful orders they're going to follow. Institutionalized insubordination is not where we want to go.
Why did you ultimately leave CIA?
Oh, that's a very long and complicated question, and it works on different levels. I'm glad that I left when I did. Not because I didn't like it, loved every minute of it. Within CIA at that time, as in many organizations, at many times, there were a lot of internal controversies. And I would probably not be the first one to find himself in a position where his boss had previously had his job. And when you set out to do the job differently from your predecessor, when your predecessor is now your boss, your days are probably going to be numbered.
Why write this book now?
If I'd written this book back immediately after I got out of CIA, it would have been a different book. It would have essentially been an adventure story. And I think a fairly compelling adventure story because there were a lot of extraordinary things that happened during those 88 days. But what I didn't know at that time was that we were going to be fighting essentially another war in Afghanistan. I didn't know the rest of the story. I didn't know how this thing was going to turn out, at least in terms of the active U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan. So the core of the story is still the same, but the context in which I present it is really quite different.
President Ghani has requested some flexibility on our drawdown timelines, and I've decided that we will maintain our current posture of 9,800 troops through the end of this year.
Last month, the Obama administration announced that it would slow the pace of withdrawal of the last remaining U.S. troops from Afghanistan at the request of the country's president, Ashraf Ghani, setting the stage for another bloody year of battle against insurgents. Despite the promises, America's longest war appears to be getting longer. Grenier, who now works for a financial firm focused on the security and intelligence sector, says for all of the billions of dollars spent in Afghanistan and lives lost, there's little to show.